Good afternoon. Good morning, actually. I was expecting another video, but it didn't play, so you've caught me a little bit off guard. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Mustafa Al-Rawi, your moderator for this session. We have an esteemed panel that's going to be discussing the topic of post-globalization. I'll do the quick introductions. Peter Frankopan, the esteemed Oxford historian, who caused...
Steamed or esteemed?
Esteemed.
Yeah, I was about to say
yes.
It's warm, but not that hot, yeah.
Definitely esteemed.
Thank you.
For sure. And your book, The Silk Roads, just over a decade ago, turned you into a literary star, according to observers and analysts. And your latest book, The Earth Transformed, An Untold Story, is an astonishing work. So thank you so much, Peter, for being with us today. Thank you. And Dubai Abulhoul, Emirati author, Rhodes Scholar, and also the founder of the think tank, the Fiker Institute. Thank you also for being with us today. Very much esteemed as well, I will say so. It's a great week to be having this discussion. We've had a lot of good inputs from global leaders like Mark Carney, Donald Trump, other notables about what the world order should look like. But I think given that we do have a historian here, it might be worth getting your viewpoints on sort of the bigger picture. Where are we in terms of globalization? Kind of where were we and where we are? I don't want to turn it into a lecture, but definitely want to get your views on this.
I'll do 45 minutes, and then I'll give Dubai 30 seconds. No, it's always interesting watching the proceedings at Davos, because the one thing that they never, and the people they never bring to Davos are historians. Always politicians, economists, philanthropists, teachers, people who work in NGOs, think tanks, etc. So the problem therefore then is that you get sound bites that are history or politics by PowerPoint. So Howard Lutnick saying globalization is dead, it has not served the West. And if, well, I don't know, I don't think Howard Lutnick is here today. If he is, hi Howard. You know, if I had a student who said that, without sounding too patronizing, I'd probably want to pick up on a few things about what does globalization mean, what does dead mean, what does the West mean, and I'd probably start from there and think about what are the historical parallels, and also, does what that mean, what I think what he was saying was nothing to do with globalization. I think what he was actually saying was America wants to use its muscles in different ways, more coercively than it has before. So he doesn't mean we're now going to build handsets and telephones in Arizona only using American workers and only using materials that you find in North America under the soil, because most of the things you need to build an iPhone you don't make, and you can't find in the United States. So I think there's a dislocation between what we all think globalization is, and it's basically a political statement about the fact that the United States doesn't want to treat any other state as equal, and that's not what globalization has ever meant. So I think all the sort of the chatter about what do we, and we could be stuck here for the next few hours talking about globalization, but it's about the political posture of political leaders in this particular moment in time, usually speaking to domestic audiences, rather than something much more fundamental. And if it is to be something more fundamental, then we do need to think about resources, supply chains, onshoring, offshoring, migration, digitals, etc., etc. So it's a bit more complicated, but I probably, with my opening comments, I'm a bit skeptical about the idea that globalization is either dead or dying.
I mean, would you agree that we maybe don't have a full picture of where we are in terms of sort of the world order and how things are going? I mean, from your perspective, I think you can give a kind of regional view, if you like.
I think the term global has always been quite loaded when we, at least growing up in this region, have seen that for far too long the word global has always meant Western/American, and this idea of this hierarchical identity structure and multilateralism is something that, you know, at least for myself growing up, I've always felt like, you know, being global is a celebration of it's sort of like an equalizer, really, versus we're looking at one country or one region to lead what that means. So I think many young people in the region haven't really felt represented in what globalization looks like. And even more so, I think, with the events of this erosion of globalization and this contestation of narratives, as we were discussing, I think in the middle of all the dust and the turbulence, there might be a chance to sort of reclaim what that can uniquely mean. But it definitely, you know, I'm a multilateralist at heart. I think multilateralism is the only way forward. But I think the question is, how do we sort of look at this chaos that we see as an opportunity for us to build something that's actually representative? So whether it's institution building, whether it's regionalization, we do need each other without the US. But it's still to be seen, I think, what that would look like over the next 3 years.
You make a really good point about what globalization means to each of us. I mean, to your point, you could talk about it for hours and maybe disagree on definitions, and it's a little bit nebulous. I mean, for me, what globalization means is that wherever I am in the world, there is, at least in terms of economically or culturally, or there is a kind of frame of reference that we can all kind of agree on. Wherever you go, there is something that is familiar, whether that's because of the products or something else.
Yeah, I don't think that, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I don't want to live in a world like that where everyone wears the same things and we're all eating baked beans on toast. I love the fact that you can come to Dubai and you have cuisine from 180 different cultures, and you know, the diversity is not just a nice idea that we have people with different viewpoints. It also is a rich tapestry of life, that there are different ways of seeing things, doing things, and so on. So globalization and standardization is something very different. And I think that, you know, Dubai is right that when we think about globalization, we tend to think about it from a Western perspective. Ironically, these last 40 years have been very good for global south countries or middle or low income countries or whatever we'd like to call them. And all these terms are, of course, highly loaded. But I think the ways in which we can move around the world, you know, as Theresa May put it in a speech that slightly backfired. She said, if you're a citizen of everywhere, you're a citizen of nowhere. And that globalization sounds like an elitist project. It sounds like the people who can be globalized are people who come to festivals like this, who fly in and talk amongst peers. And actually, global doesn't mean something if you're a migrant worker. In fact, because Dubai and the Emirates have had the history they've had since 1971, you can make the opposite case, which is that if anywhere is global, where you have lots of different voices, communities and diversities, this is probably a more global city than anywhere else on earth at the moment. So a lot depends on whether you want to throw stones at the glass building or whether you're inside the building trying to keep them away from you. But I think that if you start where any rational person would start, which is, I understand all these arguments, I'm familiar with them, I might have a view, I want facts, and I want to start with fundamentals. And if you start with the fundamentals, you look at global trade flows in the last week of January 2026, and they're the highest they've ever been in human history. So the idea that we're on the point of rupture doesn't look plausible to me. The amount of goods being shipped through Jebel Ali, the amounts of global connections, and we saw China report at the beginning of this year $1 trillion trade surplus, $1.2 trillion trade surplus. Now, all of those things, they translate into where is power being distributed and what do ambitions look like and what do those trade flows mean for opportunities for states and their leaders or their parliaments or businesses to act in different ways. And that's a slightly different question to the concept of, is it a good or a bad thing that there are global airlines that you can travel around the world where, you know, it's cheaper and faster and safer than any point in human history. And that's good if you're at the front of the plane, but it's also great if you're a migrant worker and you're able to visit your family. And I was talking to Salim here in the lift today, who works in the hotel, how cheap it is for him to, or how expensive it is for him to get to see his family in Bangladesh. And it's probably quite a good thing that there are budget airlines that can get him there quickly. Otherwise, his connections with his home community disappear. So those things are threatening if you want them to be threatening, but they don't have to be.
Is it a zero-sum game, this sort of global trade? Yes, it's rising, but not everyone can win. And is there a thread between those that are benefiting most and the power they wield in
I can
today's
give
world?
a quick answer, which is ask a historian, and what a historian will tell you, it's about the narrative. It's what is the story you're telling, and can you explain it to people? And I think that that is the way in which some political leaders at the moment capitalize on rupture, because the story you can tell can be one that is dislocating. So, I mean, it's not perhaps a coincidence that President Trump, you know, the United States is a hugely important power, huge respect for the things that they do, the businesses, etc. You know, it's a real shame that it's seen now in so many parts of the world as a threat, and the discourse, I think, is very dangerous to now think of the West as destabilizing and predatory. But it's no surprise that Trump's tagline is not "Make America Great," it's "Make America Great Again." And that lean into history to say we've lost something and we need to restore it. And that's quite effective if you want to get elected back into office. But it's not helpful if you then can't translate that into something more positive. So I think that that arc of what's the story is something that historians think about and enlightened leaders try to think about, whether you're in the Emirates today or you know, in charge of one of the great empires or city-states in history.
Talking about middle powers, and it seems to be the time for middle powers to have a voice outside of constructs like maybe the United Nations or otherwise. I mean, and you know, from what Peter was saying, one of the results of globalization has been an elevation of the influence of these middle powers. We see that sustained now in whatever the new era is.
It's interesting because I feel like despite the doom and gloom we see now and sort of this collective panic on the state of multilateralism and global affairs, the global majority, not to sound, you know, not like a capital GM, but the global majority, which are medium to small states, they're in a rejection of this chaos. You know, there is a commonality that we do want to go back to, you know, the most basic principles of political decorum, of you know, rational thinking. So yes, I think we are being swung by a very irrational White House, but you do have the majority of the international community that want to step in and have some form of normalcy. And that's where I think middle powers come in. I've seen analysts recently call them the swing states. So sort of looking at all these middle powers as, you know, where will you align with who? But one interesting framing I've seen is this, that I don't think applies to places like the Gulf or the Middle East, is looking at the world in binary terms of US versus China. So framing this globalization or, you know, anti-globalization as you're either on the US camp or on the Chinese camp. And that's not the lens that at least Gulf states look at the world through. I think there's going to be a lot of coalitions of the willing on different thematic areas that countries want to work on. But it might actually prompt even more cooperation, trilateral agreements, different alternatives, not because we want to erode the UN, but in the absence of structures that can deliver real change, you know, countries have to kind of creatively look at bypassing deadlocks like the UN Security Council, for example. So I do see a bigger role for middle powers and perhaps unique forms of minilateralism, as some have seen.
Say minilateralism. Interesting.
Dubai, you know, Emirates, Dubai, Abu Dhabi are classic Silk Road states or oasis states where you're aware. So I mean, middle powers it's you know, like all labels, you either like it or you don't. But it's because the explanation of what you have in common is quite hard. So why Silk Road is quite a useful label is because it sort of captures that there is a vast network. And all these different nodes in the network are mutually independent, but they have high levels of dependency on each other, on the understanding that if there's a buyer and seller, if there are travelers, if there are merchants, then conditions like security, conditions like freer trade or low levels of taxation are mutually beneficial. So the ways in which everybody wins and everybody loses are parts of those rhythms in history. Now, because of great connectivities, you know, it's how can you connect Panama, Dubai, you know, Mexico, Vietnam, what have you got in common? And suddenly you've got like playing Scrabble, like too many letters to create into a label like BRICS, or you know, and not everywhere's in the same neighborhood of Asia, Eurasia, and Africa. So Silk Road is quite useful, but that feels very familiar. The kind of the tapestry of states that recognize they've got different cultures, different histories, but they've got similar problems and similar questions they're trying to ask. And the reason why there's much higher levels of cooperation is not just because there's power, but it's because everyone wants to not be in a position where they're choosing between one side or another. That's usually a notional choice, again, done by PowerPoint, rather than something that's actually fundamental.
I mean, it feels there are so many contradictions alive today in the world. I mean, one, while you were speaking, I was thinking, the US dollar remains so dominant in terms of the financial system, and we, anyone who's part of the dollar system will have to adhere to the rules that are set in place by the US. But at the same time, our trade is interlinked, but we also claim that we're fragmented and that we're not kind of working together, and there's a lot of conflict. And yet, in my lifetime, the Middle East has been, what we call the Middle East has been synonymous with conflict. Yet now I see as much conflict in Europe, in Latin America, elsewhere as there is in the Middle East. It does feel like...
I'm not sure that's... I don't think I can let you get away with that, Mustafa. What we've seen in Gaza is not being echoed in South America or Europe.
The level of devastation.
Yeah. No, so there are things that might happen that might, but I think we do need to prioritize and see what the complete destruction of what's happened in Gaza, and call it for what it is. So there are lots of reasons why that's happened. There are lots of reasons why different states have intervened or not intervened. But even the situation in Ukraine is different to what's happened in Gaza. So I think it is sometimes easy to fall into the state of whataboutism and say we see fracture everywhere. We don't tend to see fracture everywhere. Actually, most of us in the world get on okay. We try to use our influence in the best possible ways that we can. But I think that we're not seeing a world that's falling apart and in flames. There are key places. And the question about the dollar, I mean, as it happens, the reason why the dollar underpins the global economy is not because of the strength of the Federal Reserve, but it's because it underpins oil prices. It's specifically the petrodollar is what makes the dollar so important, connections to energy prices globally. So it's not just that Uncle Sam has got big biceps and Trump is able to shape the world. It's because the US economy is by far the largest in the world. China is gaining, but on PPP terms, not in actual terms. So per capita income in China is about $12,000. In the United States is above $70,000. So China and Chinese Politburo, as well as think tanks, will keep trying to remind that China is a medium to low income country. And that's the quality of life in China is not what it is in the Emirates or in London or in the United States.
It's true. That's fair.
Sorry.
No, you're right to call me out. Absolutely. And I mean, I'll bring you in on this, Dubai. I mean, Peter's saying that not everything is equal. So, you look at what's happening in Gaza and you can't compare it to Ukraine or anywhere else. But at the same time, if we're saying economically, the dollar is by far the most powerful financial instrument there is in the world today. How does that impact how, you, when you're talking to your clients, or you're doing your analysis, helping people to kind of navigate success in this kind of world?
I think one thing that's also sort of coincided with the situations that we see, not just in the region, but also globally, is what we thought was a sustainable architecture for multilateral cooperation. That has also not led to the sort of like equitable results we need for different regions, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's the Gulf. So the very architecture that we would usually go to or revert back to fix these issues, quote unquote, UN Security Council, World Bank, IMF, they're in paralysis right now. And so there has to be a moment of full global governance reform, and that might actually move a lot of these issues back to what we call regional multilateralism. So how can we have a bigger role for the Arab League? How can we reinvigorate the Gulf Cooperation Council? BRICS, for example, I know the framing in the West has sort of made it into an anti-West camp, but really, I think if it deliberately chooses to move away from that framing, could we see a BRICS Security Council? Could we see a more global South-led institutions? We are in a moment where I think we lack the political imagination to look at, what are different frameworks we have to build, and that's not going to happen overnight. Particularly in the Middle East, we need a stronger Arab League. We need stronger structures, as opposed to us exporting our crises to these different multilateral organizations that are frankly too far away from our region itself.
It feels like we have to come up with the solutions ourselves. There is no one's coming to save us at all. But if we look at a long enough timeline, we can be optimistic that things can potentially improve over time, even if things do seem bleak in certain areas at the moment.
While we're up on the stage talking, any woman who gives birth anywhere in the world has the greatest chance in history of surviving childbirth, and the child has the greatest chance not only of surviving infancy, but to have access to clean water, to be able to read, to be reasonably well nourished. Extreme poverty in the world has been one of the things that has been the great triumphs of globalization. So, I think that we can talk ourselves into a place to think that the world is on fire, and it's absolutely right in terms of global climate, water, the new technologies, elite wealth, where we've got two men who've got their own space programs who are going to go and colonize different planets and plant a flag on it, so this now belongs to me. Those things are things we should worry about, disease environments, particularly emerging infectious diseases, spreads of pandemics, the ways that globalization isn't just about flow of goods, but also it's about digital transformations, human transformations. But you could take the view that for all of the terrible news we read in the papers, and it is often terrible, most of us in the world are able to recognize that different perspectives are not threatening. Most of us think that if we sit on stages and talk to each other, and we don't always have to agree with each other, but that you can find ways forward. And so, what Dubai says, how do you find different forums? Forums work when you've actually got problems you really need to solve, rather than BRICS, which is kind of a bit amorphous. There are lots of views within the BRICS countries, and in fact, even within individual countries, non-aligned views about what they think BRICS could and should do, and a group that formed as a kind of can we work together, in fact, in the last year and a half has been conspicuously disappointing by not being able to intervene or even make statements about Gaza, about Ukraine, about Venezuela, about you name it. So you think, is the capacity really there? But if the problems are there that require and give the capacity for solutions, then maybe those will swing into place. But I think it is probably worth occasionally holding up a bit of light in a dark room, rather than always talking about the things that are catastrophic. Things are typically getting better, and we might be at a turning point where suddenly the robots are going to kill us all, and there's going to be no water. Mexico City, I was in December, it's subsiding by 20 centimeters per year. Half of the world's biggest 100 cities are already experiencing extreme water stress. The UN produced a report last week that followed up the 23 report that said water, we're at vampiric stages already globally. There are lots of things that we should worry about because they're real, but perhaps if we think, what are the problems, how do we really need to solve them? I don't know, you could start with Gaza, you could start with, what the likely scenarios might be in Iran, which is not too far away from here, in the coming weeks and months, about what would be a reasonable and what would be an acceptable solution. What role could the UAE play in some form of transition if that was to happen? Is there a way in which UAE can hold the reins of a US administration that looks like, and as long with Israel, looks like it wants to do something very substantial? Are there ways in which other powers can help those conversations? The UK is part of that as well. But you need to have mutual trust. You need to be able to sit and talk to each other and to listen and not steamroller. And I think that the world of global diplomacy is more alive and well than perhaps sometimes we think.
One thing I do want to add, or sort of it's more of maybe, I guess, a question, is to what extent is globalization as we know it, or globalization as we like it, to what extent is it held hostage by the White House and the threat of tariffs, and even the idea of sort of like these BRICS countries, which, yes, I agree, some of them have direct contradictions in their policies, but this idea of every time countries want to come together to do something to counter a very US-led multilateralism, they're almost at a standstill. It's the risk of tariffs, it's the risk of ostracization, being left out of the table. So is globalization or multilateralism going to be a bit on hold for the next 3 years, or how do we see it sort of still navigating a very loud Trump presidency?
But tariffs doesn't mean globalization is ended. It's just tax. I mean, we in the UK have gone into a kind of complete cardiac arrest now. That anybody who says you should pay some tax, most people don't mind paying tax as long as they can see it's being well spent. So if it costs me a little bit more to pay for my iPhone or pay for my wine or my cheese or whatever, that's fine, as long as it's going into the hands of the government that is using it on healthcare or on roads or on schools or on things that are going to make quality of life better. I think we've gone into this sort of odd transition where certainly in democratic states, we don't trust governments. We've been told that they spend money badly, but governments, they sometimes do spend money badly, but they usually spend most of their money quite well because they are thinking about communities. They are thinking about how do you make federal states work. You know, look at UAE. If you say, well, we don't want a government here to exist, you know, things would be much less good than they are. So, you know, tariffs is something different, and I think that the US saying we're going to make you pay more, it's just the way that it's being done looks crazy. If you start taxing penguins who don't actually sell anything because they can't speak and they don't have hands to make the factories work, it looks ludicrous. But the idea of recalibrating, saying, look, we need to make sure that goods coming in from China are not just going to create a much more sophisticated and vibrant PLA army and navy, and one way to do that is to make China pay tax. So globalization doesn't mean that everything should just be free, and I don't even think conceptually it's hard to understand that the US to say, some people we're happy to let them trade with us more cheaply, but we've got others who we're going to be more selective with. I don't think that that's a hard thing for me to get my head around. So tariffs and globalization, I think it just, I mean, unless I'm misunderstanding it, you know, it's not that bad.
I think it's more what I was alluding to is the threat of tariffs forcing countries to make decisions that they may not want to do under the pressure of that threat.
Like what? I mean,
if, you know, our country's incentivized within a Trump-brokered deal to kind of give and take because of if they don't agree to a certain policy from the White House, they're going to wake up the next day with an increased tariff rate.
I mean, I'm afraid that is what's happening, you know. And so we see, you know, we see that the border peace, which is if you want to be in my team, you've got to pay cash. Trump is going to be the president of that board after he stands down as being as US president, if he stands down as US president, and is going to decide how all the money gets spent. And you know, you see his son-in-law turn up and go, "Here's my drawing that I made of what Khas is going to look like with what I think you should have for the roundabouts and the cinemas and whatever, without speaking to any single person from Khasa, whether that's what they want." That obviously is a stretch the other way, but it doesn't mean that everything is chaos and wrong. So I mean, you're right, there are choices that have to be made, and the realignment. I mean, I spend a lot of time in Asia, as we were just saying before, in different parts of this beautiful continent that has so much disparity. The thing I hear in every single corner from every place I've been in the last 6 months is that we think China is a better long-term bet than the US. And it doesn't matter whether people who are saying that are right or wrong. It's interesting, number one, that everybody is saying that. And number two, it shows me that people know as little about China as they think they know about the United States. Because, to your point, Dubai, it doesn't have to be binary, but it immediately reduces to the idea that we're having to choose between two superpowers. And I don't recognize that why people are giving that as an answer to a question they're not being asked.
It's interesting because there's a few things were coming up. One is things like Greenland are a massive distraction. And as soon as these things pop up, then things that you need to govern, you can't govern because you're dealing with this sort of public relations mess that is, you know, what's happening with Greenland. And then kind of the bigger issues that we need to tackle that we still don't have an answer for is what to do with these giant technology companies that essentially we're not taxing enough, but they have immense power. They're almost like shadow states, and we haven't had a grip on that. And again, I think, you know, to what Dubai was saying in terms of what the US demands over certain things ends up again distracting us from dealing with things that could actually help prosperity in the future if we get the right answer. But then in general, you know, I think I saw a report this morning that the US has decided that China is no longer the security risk that it believed it was, and now the risk is domestic, and it's going to focus on its borders. So suddenly, you know, the US has suddenly changed everything it's been saying for the last 2 years. So how do you set policy in that environment? So I think if we take Mark Carney as at least setting his stall out and saying, this is how I'm going to be, because I can't believe anymore 100% in the old world order, then that seems to be the only way forward, where you have to just be intentional, you have to be decisive, and you have to decide what kind of future you want, which kind of is what the middle powers are doing at the moment.
I mean, I'll pick up just on the China bit, and then let Dubai pick what she bits. But you know, I think that the omission or the playing down of China in the national security strategy and then the national defense strategy that came out on Friday is a soft touch. I mean, you don't just because it says something, the document says something, doesn't mean that it's real. And a lot of this is about positioning for what comes later in this year, which is what does a Trump and Xi meeting and summit look like? Where are the space for accommodation, and what does a grand bargain look like? And it looks to me, I think, that the kind of US Death Star is pushing itself into position. If you remember a Star Wars fan, you know, where you've got to get everything in the right.
Comforting analogy. Thank you for that.
You know, if you're a superpower, that's, I'm afraid, how things work. That's what China does too. That's what I'm afraid that Moscow. That's how superpowers think. That's how empires work. Is you line everything up, you make sure everything in your backyard is safe before, so that you've got everything allocated in the right location. So some of that stuff about China. I mean, Trump. You know, China in the National Defense Strategy is mentioned, I think, 12 times, and the word Trump is mentioned 52 times. The United Kingdom is not mentioned once. UAE is mentioned once. So, you know, but the fact that it says that doesn't mean that this is the sacred document you can't touch. It's that you need to read it as a work of literature, which is that what is not being said, and what that grand bargain might look like is going to make a huge difference to all of us, because there are obviously ways in which all of us understand that there are parts of the US infrastructure, architecture, and of China's that are no-go areas for each other, critical infrastructure, critical investments, and so on. And so how you see that dance between these two states is going to be hugely significant. But I don't think it necessarily means that, like Howard Lutnick said, that the end of the West is over and globalization has failed. I think that those are easy things to say that are reaching to domestic audiences rather than absolute narratives. But you know, it's here in the Emirates, for us in Europe, you know, there's slightly different questions about how we should react to that changing world. But the first one is, are we sure that the change is actually what we think that it is? Because perhaps it's a bit more nuanced. I don't know what you think.
If we also think about the tech companies for a second, and I'm sort of picking on your historian lens very much, similarities in the past of sort of these non-state actors that have emerged and had real influence, do they tend to stick around? You know, do they tend to kind of meld into into what is the normal tapestry?
Well, you know, things that are successful become successful for a reason, and success breeds success. Typically, what happens with companies, with states, is that you reach a tipping point where you can't keep growing, and you are well run, and then you become lazy and you get picked off, because the way in which you do things is the way in which you do things, and you can become too comfortable. So, you know, that extends to civil services, to bureaucracies, to universities. If you're really good at what you do, then you appoint based on someone who looks like yourself, who behaves like you do, and this is what success looks like. So the most interesting organizations, the most interesting states are the ones that are growing quite fast, because they are expanding on their peripheries. So I do lots of work on peripheries versus cores and centers, and that's the most interesting bit. So you're looking for things where there's not enough accountability within an organization, because then you take risks. Once something becomes really well run, then you get human resources involved, you have annual benchmark meetings, you have your evaluations, and then you suffocate. And that's when things then become turgid. So I think the risk-taking is what's key. And in these Magnificent Seven in the US, for example, it's because those frontiers are keeping on expanding. But there are dangers when corporations become too powerful and too big. Typically, that gets dealt by governments that then tax you more. And as it happens, it's not just the United States that has them too soft to touch. We have an architecture internationally that allows some of that, to allow some of these companies to become too big for their own boots. So I think global governance, when it comes to international tax, probably needs a kick in the wheels, because it's not in people's interests to have single individuals who are as wealthy as to be able to make battlefield decisions as Elon Musk has done in Ukraine. You know, I think it's not helpful if you can turn off secure communications because you don't like what the Ukrainian president said on CNN the day before. So I think some of that gets done through regulation, but the scale of these companies is unparalleled in history. So you've had great successes of businesses. They tend to be, you know, the ones probably you're trying to get me to say more stuff as the East India Company,
like Google and East India, yeah,
and opium and trafficking of human beings, and the profits those generate. You know, I'm not anti-capitalist, but when governments allow too much air into the tires, they can explode. So some of that has been about too much a light touch. but they're super successful because they're performing digital tasks that are scalable, and that's why they're now multi-trillion-dollar companies.
Also, I think the role of disinformation that's fueled by these tech companies is something that you can't sort of isolate from the current political climate. So the question of these sort of echo chambers within X, within Instagram, within the battle over TikTok, etc. So it's the question of, we were talking earlier about the war of narratives. It's pretty much still alive in those echo chambers, and how that influences sort of election campaigns, and it's all happening in parallel.
As a historian, the best and loudest and most comfortable echo chambers are ones populated exclusively by men. And it probably won't surprise you that there is no such thing as a tech girl, or no one talks about tech girls. Those tech bros who don't know what the limits of their own capabilities are is something that governments should recognize. I mean, I've done lots of that with governments in the UK and the US, and in fact in Europe, that no empire was ever built by somebody my age. Empires are built by young people, and particularly by young men. And the downside is that's why young men get run over crossing roads. That's why young men, push things too far, or they go to the gym, too much, or they drink too much. So if you take risks and you don't calibrate what the risk-reward strategy is, then it's a challenge. But it's no coincidence, I think, that these companies are all thriving with testosterone. If you recognize that, then you maybe treat them in a slightly different way.
We're moving into the age of AI, and this is obviously something that comes up all the time. And not that it's necessarily a case of whether you're pro or anti-AI, and certainly at a literary festival, we tend to be, let's stay creative and human-led. But when it comes to human history, Peter, if you were going to write a chapter in your book about the Earth, specifically about AI in the next edition, what would you likely be saying?
I'd compare it to the invention of writing scripts. So in Mesopotamia, about 4,500 years ago, the first recordings of history started to be written down. And in fact, it wasn't historians who got in touch with with scripts, it was accountants. Because what you need to make, who wants to record things tends to be rulers who want to understand who owns land. So you need to have records, and who's paying their tax. So accountants we have to thank. I write in my book for Shakespeare and the codification of the Quran. Oral traditions, better than anyone here in the Gulf, are beautiful things, and the ways in which poetry, verse, traditions change over time is one of the wonderful things about the wind blowing through the rhythms of history. When you write things down, you codify them and you make them, I don't just mean sacred about religious texts, but you make them untouchable. But what that did was it gave control of narratives to people who are able to read and write. And I suppose AI is a bit like that to do. It's who controls the algorithms and who controls the parameters of what gets digested by large language models in particular. But I mean, AI again means lots of different things. I mean, most people talk about AI, they mean, do I cheat on my essay by putting it into ChatGPT and then seeing if my professor at Oxford can tell whether
Can you tell?
Well, I'm lucky. I don't work on. If I worked on a subject that had masses written about it, you can hide it. If you enter, was Henry VIII a bad husband and a bad king? You'd probably get quite a good essay out of ChatGPT. If you try and come to me, there's not much written, so it's quite easy to check. And one thing that ChatGPT that makes it much easier for a professor is it lies all the time. So it invents things that I know probably are not true. So it doesn't take too long. But also my students, they're all extremely privileged. They know how lucky they are. They're almost to the point of being anxious about the fact that they're lucky to study at a great university like mine. So they work incredibly hard. So they don't think their job is to come there, press a button, and then go and play football or head to the pub. But I think that the familiarity of AI is the concentration of a huge amount of power into small groups of people. And in the case of Mesopotamia, other places that develop writing systems, that becomes like a priesthood. I mean, literally, because you control the message. And I suppose that looks a bit familiar, going back to the tech bros. It's, I know Sam Altman's been here in the region looking for funds for OpenAI this last few days. But it's the same sort of thing. It's someone who says, I have unlimited power. If you invest in me, I can offer you not just a financial return, but this is what this looks like for governance. This is what it looks like for control. This is what it looks like for stability. And those things can be very, very persuasive. So there's it's a little bit of a cartoon-like analogy, but it feels to me familiar with the centralization of states with the invention of writing systems.
I think what worries me is the sort of, to what extent are we on a daily basis exporting our thinking process to AI? So I think it's one thing to say, can AI beat us to writing like a research paper? But it's another where on a daily basis, we're unable to even draft emails without plugging it into ChatGPT. So what that would do to our thinking process, and perhaps we're generations that have seen the pre and post, but if you're plugging AI into kindergarten, what's going to happen to critical thinking? What's going to happen to sort of like always needing that LLM validation?
It's great for you and great for me, right? Great for us, isn't it?
I'm not complaining.
Well, it's great. I think it's great because I then suddenly add real value. Because if I can ask different questions, if I can answer them in different ways that a machine can't, then I become, then I'm definitely going to get re-invited to Emirates Literary Festival. If anybody can press a button and go, give me a history of the Silk Roads, then that doesn't have any particular, it's just soup. So if you're different, but it's not great for literature as a whole. It's not great for creative thinking or creative writing, for sure.
So like the copyright of novels and sort of this, when you try to generate a novel, it's building off the database of other people's work. So this idea of, copyright, intellectual property, I think is still unresolved.
I'm probably more relaxed than that, Dubai. I think that most academics tend to think that they've been delivered from the heavens to change the world. But, no idea comes out of the blue, So it's true, nobody abuses copyrights, but when I provide my footnotes, when I read things that other people have read, I'm learning from huge numbers of scholars, and it's true, I'm doing it myself rather than a machine doing it. But I think that process of attribution and of acknowledgement is part of a long cycle. So I'm not worried about the fact that that there's a constant co-learning and you're reading lots of different things. I think it's how do you acknowledge where those debts are. And like you said, if these these large models have scalped and not acknowledged it, that I think is where the problem is. But I'm not sure how we stop that from where we are now.
I want to open the discussion up to the audience in a moment, and there'll be some microphones going around. But I just wanted to ask you, I was curious because of the book about the Earth and climate change as is obviously another big force that we're contending with. You start the novel, you start the book with a quote from Paradise Lost, keeping very much people at the heart of this, great scholarly work on the Earth. But did your attitude to how climate change, the threat level of climate change within you from when you started the book to when you finished it?
I think like anybody who writes a book, it's a journey because nothing is quite as you think it's going to turn out. I mean, I think I kept feeling, maybe stupid is too strong, but I kept thinking, how had I not joined all this up together beforehand? How had I not realized that, Noah's flood was an environmental threat story, which was that if humans behave stupidly, selfishly, and are disobedient and, think of themselves first, they're going to be punished by environmental catastrophe, and thinking, God, that's one of the oldest things that's one of the, not just the first stories I remember from a child, but that's one of the greatest stories that's been passed from generation to generation to generation about obedience, about disobedience, about divine punishment, about, how the ecological certainty that you think you have disappears. So I remember going through, turning page after, as I was writing, thinking, gosh, it all sort of, bit like in The Matrix, the Keanu Reeves film, where all the numbers suddenly make a beautiful pattern. It all sort of, lots of things dropped into place. And so, when I've been talking about the book over the last couple of years and thinking about the world, explaining where resources, we talk about globalization, where do resources come from? Places like DRC and Rwanda, there's, where the M23 rebel group inside DRC, sits on top of some of the most important raw materials on Earth. Most people on the planet can't tell me anything about DRC or Rwanda, much more about Ukraine or about Gaza and so on. That dislocation about supply chains, about food, about everything. 75 billion chickens in the United States get killed every year, and a quarter of them never make it to the dinner table because they're over bloated, or it's birds that
75 million.
75 billion.
Billion.
Those kinds of things that you don't think about. So I thought much more, a pair of jeans uses 7,500 litres of water to make them, which is adult humans drinking water for 9 years. So it's made me change, thinking maybe I don't need a fourth or fifth pair. So I think all those things about, the good thing about writing a book is you learn a lot, and you start to feel very small. So all the things you're worried about, even things like warfare and pandemics, I wrote a lot of it during the pandemic, you think, gosh, we've been through these things much worse in the past. And so there's a real feeling of humility that maybe the problems we're facing are not as bad, and how do you get in front of some of those, particularly if you're involved like Dubai is in trying to do policy work and to do advisories. How do you calm people down and say, look, everything's going to be fine. Here are the questions you should be asking, and let's see what the answers are.
Let's go to the audience. If we have a lady at the front, could we get the microphone, please? If you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah, great. Renan Awas, friend of Dubai's, fan of Peter's. Sorry, I missed the event last night. Question about the UN. So post-globalization, we're talking about globalization. Global trade, been going on for a very, very long time. I know that from your books. The UN was created, I'd like to double click on why it was created. It has, in my opinion, failed in its basic mission. It hasn't prevented a genocide in Gaza. You have the US invading Venezuela, kidnapping heads of state and Greenland and all of it. So it's not upholding international law. It's not promoting peace. Has such an institution existed in the past? And if others evaluate the UN as I have, which is it's failed, 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 what's next?
Thank you.
That's for you.
I'm a big fan of building alternative frames of multilateral cooperation from the ground up. So that's not a satisfying answer, but I think we've all been very frustrated with the veto power, in particular within the UN Security Council, and it's built, I'm pro-reform, but I'm also recognizing that what will it take for these 5 countries to give up their veto? Probably not much. We're better off, I think, while still believing in some form of gathering organization, thinking of how do we build other structures that can answer for these questions. Who has the power to also command these centers is something that is still to be determined. But I think countries increasingly have to not necessarily bypass the UN, but when we're faced with a gridlock and with the veto powers being used left and right on every major issue, how else can we work together? What bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral frameworks should we build? Because we cannot stay in this sort of like every September at the UNGA, we go up on those podiums and we say the same things. We want UN reform. What has it translated to? And who is going to lead the alternative? These countries, one interesting thing was the EU is also lobbying for a permanent seat in the Security Council, which, to many Arab and Global South countries are saying, no, I think it's time for us to step in. So who's going to create that formula? I don't know, but I don't think it's wise to wait for the UN to fix itself. It's almost built not to fix itself. And we're, I think, better off looking at more regionalization, which unfortunately is not going to deliver immediate results. But I wonder what you think.
I think that there are lots of different UN agencies that do amazing work that don't get credit for, from UNEP to UNDP to UNESCO. So, I think the reason why we think the UN doesn't work is because no one wants it to work. So we all of us sit here thinking, surely the UN should step in, but none of its member states want to get involved and step in. And in fact, even the veto stuff doesn't get used. I should be better informed, but it's a Sunday morning, and so I'm blurry. But I think I'm right in saying that China's used its veto 18 times, and 16 times were about Syria and stopping intervention during the civil war and the breakdown. So, even how the vetoes get used, it's a bit more ad hoc and random. But the challenge, I think, is that the international community doesn't really want to function. It's not clear to me that if all the reforms that I obviously recognize the architecture of post-1945 and the makeup of the Security Council, were that to change with India or Nigeria or big states, I don't necessarily think that that's going to suddenly mean that interventions that should have taken place in Gaza would have happened or will happen. I think it's the people are very willing to see people getting mugged in the street and just keep on driving. And until we think that there are responsibilities and global leadership and incentives to get involved. So I don't think that it's the UN's fault, actually. I think it's that its member states don't want to work together, and it's sort of quite a convenient way to blame the Security Council and the General Assembly as being sort of faceless and pointless. But it's got to be better than nothing. you can rip it all down and start all over again. But if you're going to do that, you've got to make sure that it's going to do things better. And I'm perhaps a bit suspicious that that might be the case. But in terms of reforms, as Dubai says, no problem if states can agree that. But I suspect it will just be like all committees, more people on it, and the outcome's about the same. So it's for us, I think, as citizens in different countries to say, this is what we want the UN to do. We need to have boots on the ground, for example, international peacekeeping forces that the UN did very successfully in the 1980s and 1990s, still does deploy in different parts of the world. But in places like Gaza or Ukraine, Cambodia, Thailand, we need armed forces from different countries to be willing to go and serve. And I suspect if you ask Emirati soldiers to go to Venezuela or to whatever, like most countries, they say it's not really our problem. So why should we put young people's lives at risk? But if all states are willing to do it, then we should probably reform what's there rather than start again.
But then is the answer maybe regionalization? So should we stop being surprised at the deadlock within the UN? Should we stop expecting much out of these structures?
But I'm a guest here in the UAE, but look at what happened in Gaza. The Arab League didn't do its job properly. The deployment of peacekeeping forces from within neighboring states to help the Palestinians was non-existent. Egypt shut the borders. Likewise, the sort of capacity from Syria for displacement of people into Lebanon, in particular, to Jordan, had almost no financial support from regional states, including beyond, from Turkey right the way through to other states in North Africa and the Middle East too, who have the capacity to help. So I completely agree with you. Regional solutions are infinitely better. But that didn't happen in the case of...
But that's what I mean. Is it a case of do we need to look at these questions regionally and as opposed to wait for the UN to kind of be the umbrella? Should there be a bigger reform process for the Arab League, for each region to sort of look at its own affairs?
We have a question at the front.
Thank you. I'm Isha, and I just had a question regarding the rise of regionalism. So we've seen historically there have been a lot of alliances shaped on minerals and resources. We're talking things like OPEC. Now that there's a rise of green energy and the like, do we see any new alternatives in terms of alliances regarding critical minerals and the like? Or?
No, I leave that to you.
Thank you.
Do we see alliances with critical minerals? It's a very good question. Do you want to be a bit more specific exactly what you want to know about? In case I can answer, which I might not be able to.
Hey, thank you. So I think there have been a lot of very resource-rich countries in the past that perhaps have not had a very large role on the global stage. We're talking like countries like Turkmenistan, which I think has so many resources. I think, are we seeing a potential for these sorts of countries to have a more vital role on the global stage? Or are we seeing maybe a shift to green energy leadership and the like?
Gosh, what an interesting question. I think the problem is lots of states that are resource rich, apart from the resource curse, which is a whole other story, are rich typically in some substances, but not everything. So there's a need to be involved in exchanges of all kinds. So Turkmenistan, for example, has the fourth largest natural gas reserves in the world. You're right, it doesn't have a particularly important regional role. That's partly because it's like North Korea, and it's run by a single family that runs the state in a particularly strange way. So in Turkmenistan, if you want to go and buy yourself a Mars bar, it'll cost you $120. And so there are not many people in the supermarket. But so I think in global supply chains, because of the need to be integrated into so many different kinds of things, like I said, a typical iPhone has components from 40 different countries. It's quite hard to stand on your own. So a lot depends on whether you are a manufacturing hub. It depends if you are a resource hub. It depends if you're like Dubai, or Emirates, I should say, doing lots of different bits and pieces. But you can't do it all on your own. Even the US, and for all, again, there's stuff at Davos this week saying the US are going to do things on their own. You still need materials from other parts of the world. So you can't just be an island.
We'll take one last question. There's a gentleman there with his hand up. We'll give him the microphone. So the last one, let's make it a really good one.
I'm James Todd. I'm very, I think, relieved to hear the thought that the UN has been better than nothing, and I guess we'd all wish that it would continue to be better than nothing. In the context of the Board of Peace, would you see that, would you rate that as better than nothing, worse than nothing? And if worse than nothing, I hesitate to even articulate the question, but what then do you think can be done?
I think it's too early to evaluate. I think there's going to be, I read there's going to be a Washington meeting to sort of look into the details of that in the coming weeks. I think the UN has endorsed so it's based on a UN resolution. So, and I've seen the UN also be a bit cautiously optimistic about it as well. I don't have an immediate analysis of it because I too am waiting to see how it progresses. But I think anything that sort of, the alternative to it would be what is also another question we need to ask. And if there's a better sort of more regional-led approach, then I don't think the Board of Peace would replace it. What do you think?
I've learned a long time ago, if somebody says something clever that I agree with, I should just smile.
I take that as a compliment.
I think it's asking questions of what we need to be doing and what dialogue looks like over the next 5, 10, 15 years, and what kind of solutions can we come up with. And it's definitely testing not only our institutions and our way of life, but also our creativity and asking for real leadership. And I think, you know, judging by the conversation that we've heard today, we certainly have a bit of hope, maybe a little bit of hesitation about what's happening, but
we are day 3 of the Board of Peace. You know, so I don't think we've had a huge opportunity to see it, but, you know, I think it's, you know, let's start at the beginning. Is there a two-state solution? Is Palestine going to be recognized as an independent state? And that needs input from Palestinian voices in the first instance, but then obviously neighboring states have a bigger stake in that question than perhaps others on other sides of the world. So, you know, Dubai is absolutely right. All community action starts from the bottom up, and it starts in your own neighborhood, and then you escalate street by street, region by region. And so the greater levels of integration you can have in this neighborhood, like we've tried in Europe, then the better. But you don't have to agree with everybody all the time, but it's also, can you deal with those disagreements in polite, generous and kind ways? And Trump doesn't instinctively think in that way, which is a bad example to those of us who are trying to bring up our children to try to be polite and to solve problems through discussion. But, you know, the world will keep on spinning. I mean, unless somebody presses a big red button and kills us all, you know, the world will keep on moving, and we hopefully learn the lessons of what happens when there are periods of dislocation. But people try to solve problems, I think we should try to stand behind them rather than always criticize.
Thank you for your contributions and for being here and for being part of this session. I'd like to thank our AV team, our volunteers, our translators, our title sponsor, Emirates Airline, our founding partner, Dubai Culture, our parent organization, the Emirates Literature Foundation, and our session sponsor, Karma. And of course, please join me in thanking Peter and Dubai for their wonderful insights. Thank you.